3 months ago, my stepfather embarrassed me at a family dinner. I had no idea that night would end with me holding a piece of information that could destroy his reputation and the perfect chance to make sure everyone heard it. Family dinners in our house have always been a strange performance, part obligation, part silent competition, and part theater nobody bought tickets for. My mom likes to pretend they're warm, wholesome gatherings. In reality, they're a stage where my stepfather, Greg, plays the role of the charming patriarch, while everyone else either laughs on cue or keeps their mouth shut. When Greg married my mom, I was already in my late teens. I never called him dad, and he never pushed me to. At least, not directly. But over the years, his way of bonding with me became little jabs, disguised as jokes, in front of family and friends. They always got a polite chuckle from the table, but I felt the sting long after dessert was cleared. It was easier to let it slide. My mom would say, "That's just his humor, don't take it personally." And I tried. I really did. But every jab chipped away at the thin piece we had, until it felt like I was just an easy target for his smug one-liners. This particular dinner, the one that started everything, was supposed to be about my mom's birthday. She'd gone all out with the cooking, the table was set like a magazine spread, and the house smelled like roasted garlic and lemon. My cousins were there, a couple of uncles, my mom's friends, the usual mixed bag of people who all had their own little alliances and opinions. I was at the far end of the table, halfway through telling my cousin about a project I'd been working on, when Greg decided to cut in. His voice had that deliberate volume he uses when he wants to make sure the whole room hears. "You know," he said, with that smirk I've seen 1,000 times. "It's amazing how someone can be so busy and still be completely useless." The laughter was instant. Short, sharp, and awkward. The kind where people laugh not because it's funny, but because it's easier than dealing with the tension. I felt my face heat up, my throat tighten. My mom shot him a look, but she didn't say anything. No one did. I just sat there, nodding like it was nothing, but inside my chest it felt like a kettle starting to boil. I'd learned to pick my battles, but something about that moment stuck deeper than the rest. Maybe it was because of who was there. Maybe it was the way he looked at me afterward, like he'd scored some kind of point. Little did I know, that night wouldn't end with me swallowing another insult. Before the last plate was cleared, I'd have a piece of information, something Greg had been hiding, and I'd know exactly how to use it. The rest of that dinner should have been routine. Greg got his laugh, I took the hit, everyone moved on. That's how it usually went. But this time, I couldn't force myself to rejoin the conversation. I kept hearing that word in my head. Useless, like he'd branded it on me in front of everyone. I focused on my plate, cutting the same piece of roasted chicken over and over without eating it. Around me, forks clinked, wine glasses chimed. Someone was telling a story about their new boat. Greg leaned back in his chair, already shifting the spotlight back to himself, talking about some business opportunity he was exploring. That's when my Uncle Mark, who's never been subtle about his skepticism toward Greg, leaned toward me and muttered, "Funny how he talks like a CEO," but he didn't finish the sentence, just smirked and went back to his bread roll. It was a tiny comment, easy to ignore, but something about the way he said it, almost like he was holding back more, made me pay closer attention to Greg. He was explaining this deal in vague, grand terms. Partners overseas, a startup in stealth mode, and confidential clients. His voice was smooth, confident, but the more he talked, the more I realized how little he was actually saying. I noticed my mom nodding along, her hand resting on his arm. She looked proud, and I wondered if she even knew the details, or if she just wanted to believe him. Halfway through dessert, the conversation shifted when my cousin asked Greg if his business trip last week had gone well. Greg didn't miss a beat. "Very well," he said, smiling wide. "Made some great connections. Could change everything for us." And then, the first crack. My mom froze for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but I caught it. She glanced at him, then quickly looked down at her plate. It wasn't the look of someone hearing good news. It was the look of someone who knew something she wasn't supposed to react to. I told myself not to read into it. I had no proof, no reason to start digging yet. But the moment lodged itself in my brain. When dinner ended, people started moving to the living room for coffee. I stayed behind to help my mom clear the table. Greg was still holding court with a few relatives, his voice carrying across the house. That's when my mom, in a low voice, said, "Don't let him get to you." I wanted to believe it was just about the useless comment, but her tone was heavier. And when she turned away to grab another plate, I caught something in her eyes, a mix of frustration and worry. That was the moment I knew there was more to Greg's little empire than he was letting on. And if I could figure out what it was, maybe I could return the favor from that dinner table, in front of the same audience. But that was just the beginning of my nightmare. 2 days later, I was still thinking about that dinner. Not the food, not the birthday cake, just the way Greg's face had lit up when he got his laugh at my expense, and the way my mom's had dimmed when he talked about his business trip. I tried to let it go. I told myself that digging into Greg's life wasn't my job. But the thing about suspicion is that once it's planted, it starts growing on its own. And mine was starting to take root fast. The first thread came from somewhere I didn't expect. Our kitchen counter. Greg has a habit of leaving his mail scattered there before he sorts it. Most of it's junk, glossy brochures, pre-approved credit card offers. But that morning, buried under an electric bill, was an envelope marked Final Notice. The return address was a bank I didn't recognize. I froze, staring at it. My first thought was that it wasn't my business. My second thought was that Greg had been bragging about his financial success for months, and here was a bank threatening. What? Foreclosure? Collections? I slid it back exactly where I'd found it, careful not to disturb the pile. But now I had more questions than answers. Later that day, I overheard him in the garage, talking on the phone. His voice was low, tense, a sharp contrast to the smooth charm he used at the dinner table. No, I told you it's temporary. I'm waiting on the wire. Just keep them off my back until Monday. I was in the laundry room, folding towels, pretending not to listen. But every word felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. Greg wasn't a successful businessman. He was scrambling. Still, suspicion isn't proof. And I knew if I confronted him without evidence, he'd turn it back on me. He was good at that, twisting things until I sounded paranoid. The next clue came from my Uncle Mark, again. I ran into him at the grocery store that weekend. We made small talk in the snack aisle, but before we parted, he said, "Careful with Greg. Guys like that, they only look stable until they don't." I wanted to press him for details, but Mark just patted my shoulder and walked off. That night, I lay in bed replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Greg. The business trips, the vague explanations, the way he always had an excuse for why certain bills went unpaid by mistake. It was like looking at an image you've seen 100 times, only now noticing the flaws in it. The cracks. By the end of the week, my suspicion had shifted into something else, quiet determination. I didn't want to just catch him in a lie. I wanted the truth to come out where it would sting the most, in front of the same people who'd laughed at me that night. I didn't know how yet, but I could feel the opportunity forming, just out of reach. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, it landed in my lap, and it was so much bigger than I expected. The rain that Tuesday had been steady since morning, turning the streets into shallow rivers and the gutters into waterfalls. I was home alone, or so I thought, working on my laptop at the kitchen table. The sound of the garage door caught me off guard. Greg walked in, soaked to the bone, carrying a thin leather briefcase. He looked surprised to see me, but covered it quickly with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't expect anyone home," he said, setting the case on the counter. He went upstairs to change, leaving the briefcase sitting there like it was nothing. Normally, I wouldn't have touched it. But the thing about suspicion is, once it's deep enough, you start seeing moments like this as invitations. I hesitated only a second before flipping the clasps. Inside was a neat stack of documents, bound with a rubber band. The first few sheets were business proposals, vague, full of buzzwords, nothing concrete. But halfway through the stack, I found them. Overdue statements, collection notices, and a letter from the same bank I'd seen on the kitchen counter. The words "loan default" jumped out at me in bold print. Another page detailed an asset repossession scheduled for next month. My pulse was pounding in my ears. This wasn't just a hiccup in his business. Greg was in serious financial trouble. Then came the page that made my stomach drop, a signed agreement showing he'd put my mom's house up as collateral. Our house, the one she'd owned before she even met him. Her name wasn't anywhere on the paperwork. I shoved the documents back into the case and snapped it shut just as I heard footsteps on the stairs. My hands were trembling, and I tried to busy them by rearranging some dishes in the sink. Greg walked back in, now in a dry shirt, and gave me a long look. "You look pale," he said, his tone casual but probing. Just tired, I lied. My voice sounded flat, even to me. He poured himself coffee and launched into small talk about the weather. I nodded along, but inside, something had shifted. This wasn't just about him being a smug jerk at dinner. This was about my mom's security, her home, her life. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the image of her losing everything because of him. And the worst part? I couldn't tell her yet. Not without proof she couldn't ignore, and a way to make sure Greg couldn't twist the story. That night, I called Uncle Mark. I didn't tell him everything, but I asked straight out, "What do you know about Greg's business?" There was a pause. Then Mark said, "Enough to know it's built on a house of cards." What? I told him I might need his help soon. He didn't ask for details, just said, "You know where to find me." I hung up with my heart racing. I had proof now, but proof alone wasn't enough. I needed a plan, one that would end with Greg's own words exposing him in front of everyone. I wasn't ready for what I was about to discover next. 2 days later, I got the deeper cut, the one that made my skin crawl. Greg was out meeting a client, and my mom was in the living room, scrolling on her tablet. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard her mutter something under her breath. "You okay?" I asked, leaning against the doorway. She hesitated, then tilted the tablet toward me. It was an email, not meant for her, clearly, that Greg had forwarded by mistake. It was from a man named Richard Holt, subject line, "Urgent, wire transfer pending." The body of the message was short but ugly. "Greg, the money has to land by Friday or the deal's off. I can't stall the others any longer. They're already asking about the collateral." Collateral. That word again. I glanced at my mom. Her lips were pressed tight, her knuckles white where she gripped the tablet. "Why do you have this?" I asked. She sighed. "He asked me to print something for him yesterday. Must have forgotten this was in the thread." I didn't know what it meant. I knew exactly what it meant, and I could see the flicker of realization in her eyes now that I'd said nothing to reassure her. That night, I went digging. If Greg was involved in something shady, maybe the answer wasn't just in his briefcase. Maybe it was in his digital trail. He wasn't the most tech-savvy guy, and I remembered once seeing him type his email password right in front of me. I'd never paid attention before, but apparently my brain had filed it away. I sat at my laptop, heart hammering, and tried it. 3 wrong guesses later, I hit the right one. Suddenly, I was staring at his inbox. The last month of emails was like peeling wallpaper in an old house, layer after layer of rot underneath. There were urgent requests for payments, threats of legal action, and a particularly nasty chain where someone accused him of misrepresenting assets. There were no clients, no investors, just creditors and people he owed money to. And then, buried deep in his sent folder, I found something worse. A PDF of a forged document. My mom's signature, but not in her handwriting. The file name made my stomach turn. house_addendum_april.pdf. He'd expanded the collateral agreement without telling her. If things went south, she wouldn't just lose the house. She could be on the hook for his debts. I closed the laptop, feeling sick. This wasn't just arrogance or bad luck on Greg's part. This was deliberate, calculated. My first instinct was to confront him that night. But then I thought about the dinner table, about everyone's laughter when he called me useless. No, I wanted that same table to see him stripped bare. I needed to catch him in his own words, in a way no one could deny. And thanks to one particular email, I realized exactly when and where I could make that happen. It was coming sooner than I thought. This went so much deeper than I'd imagined. For the next few days, I moved like someone walking around with a live wire in their pocket. Hyper-aware, on edge, every conversation with Greg laced with the knowledge of what I now knew. The email from Richard Holt had mentioned Friday. That was 3 days away, which meant whatever Greg was scrambling to do, it was coming to a head soon. The problem was figuring out how to make his own lies blow up in his face, and do it in front of the exact people he wanted to impress. I made lists in my head. Options. Risks. Timing. Option 1. Tell my mom everything right now. But that risked her confronting him privately, giving him a chance to spin the story, maybe even hide the evidence. Option 2. Confront him myself at home. No witnesses. Satisfying in the short term, but ultimately useless. Option 3. Make sure his mask slips in public at a moment when he can't backpedal without exposing himself. That was the one I kept circling back to. But then came the doubt. I wasn't the kind of person who set traps. I'd spent years keeping my head down, swallowing insults for the sake of family harmony. Was I really ready to burn that bridge completely? Every time I hesitated, I pictured that night at dinner, the smirk, the laughter, the heat rising in my face. And then I pictured my mom's house deed, sitting in some banker's file as collateral for a debt she didn't even know she had. That decided it for me. I started small. I called Uncle Mark and told him I'd need him at the next family gathering, specifically the one coming up this weekend. My mom had planned a casual get-together for relatives who couldn't make her birthday. Greg would be there, holding court again. Mark didn't ask many questions, just said, "I'll be there, and I'll back you up." Next, I printed copies of the documents I'd found, the loan default notices, the repossession letter, and the forged signature. I put them in a plain folder and stashed it in my bag. The final piece was trickier. I needed Greg to talk about his business in front of everyone, confidently, in detail, the way he loved to. And I needed a way to introduce the topic without making it obvious. That's when I remembered my cousin, Paul. He's the kind of guy who can't resist asking harmless but loaded questions. A quick text and a promise of a favor later, he was on board. He'd steer the conversation toward Greg's latest big deal and keep him talking. The pieces were falling into place. Still, the night before the gathering, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. Part of me wondered if this would backfire, if Greg would turn it all around on me and I'd end up the villain. But another part of me, the part that had been humiliated, dismissed, and ignored, knew this was my only shot. I spent sleepless nights planning. Finally, I knew what I had to do. The get-together started exactly the way I expected. Greg in the center of the living room, glass of wine in hand, recounting his busy week with just enough vagueness to make it sound important. My mom bustled around with appetizers, and the cousins sprawled on the couch with plates in their laps. I kept my expression neutral, waiting for my cue. Paul arrived a little late, which actually worked in my favor. People turned their attention toward him, and within minutes he slid into the seat across from Greg. "So," he said casually, "heard you've got something big in the works. That trip last week was for the deal, right?" Greg smiled like a man being fed his favorite dessert. "Exactly. Met some high-level investors. We're finalizing the paperwork as we speak. Could be life-changing." That was all Paul needed. He kept him talking, asking about the overseas partners, the confidential terms, the impressive figures. Greg leaned back, warming to his own performance, tossing around buzzwords like confetti. I waited until he mentioned secured assets before making my move. "That reminds me," I said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Greg, did you ever resolve that? What was it?" "Loan default." The shift was immediate. His smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before snapping back into place. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said lightly, laughing it off. "Strange," I said, pulling the folder from my bag, "because I found some documents that looked pretty serious. Thought maybe you'd want to clear it up." The room went quiet. My mom froze halfway to the kitchen. Greg stood, holding out his hand. "Let's not make a scene. Whatever you think you have, it's a misunderstanding." For a moment, I almost believed the act. His voice was calm, his posture steady. He looked like a man in control. I could feel the doubt creeping in, whispering that maybe this was the moment to back off. Instead, I placed the folder on the coffee table and slid it toward Paul. "Go ahead. Take a look." Paul opened it, his eyes scanning the pages. His eyebrows rose, and he let out a low whistle. This looks bad, man." Greg laughed again, but it was thinner now. "Old paperwork. Nothing to worry about." For a brief moment, I thought that might be it, that he'd smooth talk his way out of it, and everyone would just move on. He'd done it before. The tension in the room eased slightly as people exchanged uncertain glances. Then Uncle Mark walked in from the patio, holding his phone. "Funny," he said, "because I just got off the phone with a guy named Richard Holt. Ring any bells, Greg?" The color drained from Greg's face. I thought it was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. The moment Uncle Mark said Richard Holt's name, it was like someone had yanked the plug out of the room. Every trace of Greg's fake charm evaporated. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted toward my mom, then back to Mark. "I don't know who that is," Greg said, but his voice had lost its polish. Mark stepped further into the room, holding his phone out like a prop in a courtroom drama. "Funny, because he sure knows you. Said you owe him a wire transfer by Friday, and if it doesn't come through, the whole deal collapses." "Oh," he glanced at my mom. And apparently the collateral is this house. The silence was thick enough to choke on. My mom's hand went to her mouth, and I saw the color drain from her face. Greg's composure cracked. It's not what you think. Business deals are complicated. Sometimes you need to leverage assets. By forging my signature, my mom cut in. Her voice was shaking, but the words landed like a hammer. That wasn't part of my plan. I'd wanted to lead him into admitting it himself, but now the accusation was out there, raw and undeniable. Greg turned to her, his tone suddenly soft, pleading. It was temporary, just to keep things moving. I was going to fix it before you even noticed. That's not how collateral works, Greg. Mark interrupted. You lose the deal, you lose the house. No fixing that. I thought this was it, the big collapse, the part where Greg's lies finally crumbled. But instead of breaking, he pivoted. He turned toward me. You think you're some kind of hero here? You've been looking for a reason to undermine me since day one. You're jealous. You've never accomplished anything, so you want to drag me down with you. The shift was jarring. Suddenly the spotlight was back on me, and I could feel the eyes of the room turning with it. The doubt I'd worried about in scene 5 hit me like a wave. This isn't about me, I said, forcing my voice to stay level. This is about you lying to everyone in this room, and putting Mom's home on the line to cover your mess. He laughed, but it was sharp and ugly now. And you think anyone here believes you over me? For a second, I didn't know if they would. Greg had years of charm banked with this family, and I just started cashing in on my credibility. Then Paul slid the folder across the coffee table again, this time toward my mom. Read it. All of it. She did. And when she looked up, her face was set in a way I'd never seen before. I want you out, she said to Greg, her voice low but firm. Now, that's when things got loud. Greg started pacing, throwing out half-baked threats about lawyers, about how he'd take what's his, about how we'd all regret this. The room fractured into voices, some trying to calm him, others telling him to leave. I realized then that this wasn't over, not even close. If anything, I'd just lit the fuse. What happened next made me question everything. After the shouting in the living room died down, my mom retreated to the kitchen, pale and shaking. Greg followed her in, speaking in a low, intense voice I couldn't quite hear from where I stood. I thought she was telling him to pack his things, but when I stepped closer, I caught the end of his sentence. And if you push me, I'll make sure you lose more than just this house. Her eyes flicked to me, but she didn't say anything. Greg walked past without a glance, heading upstairs. I wanted to follow him, to tell him exactly what I thought of his threats. But my mom grabbed my arm and shook her head. Not now, she whispered. The rest of the evening was a blur. Guests made awkward excuses and left early, the atmosphere heavy and sour. Mark offered to stay the night, but my mom insisted she was fine. She wasn't. When I went to bed, I kept my door locked, something I hadn't done in years. Around midnight, I heard Greg's footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. They stopped outside my room for a few seconds before moving on. My skin prickled. The next morning, he was gone, but so was the folder with the documents. I tore through the house looking for it. Nothing. My laptop was still there, but when I checked, I saw my email had been accessed overnight. A few files in my evidence folder were deleted. Panic clawed at my throat. Without those papers, it would be his word against mine. I went downstairs to find my mom sitting at the kitchen table, staring into her coffee. She looked older than she had the day before. He took them, I said. I know, she replied quietly. He came into my room last night. Said he'd clean up the mess if I stopped listening to you. The helplessness in her voice hit harder than anything Greg had said to me. This was the man she'd trusted, the one she defended when I told her his jokes weren't harmless. And now he was holding her future hostage. For a moment, I wondered if I'd just made everything worse. My plan had been to expose him, but all I'd done was push him into a corner, and now he was fighting back in ways I hadn't prepared for. Mark called later that day, asking if I still had the copies I'd given him. I froze. You still have them? Of course, he said. I made duplicates. Figured Greg might try something stupid. Relief crashed over me, but it was short-lived. Greg still had control of the house, the finances, and, worst of all, my mom's willingness to give him the benefit of the doubt. That night, I lay awake, replaying every moment since that first dinner. I'd wanted him exposed in front of everyone, but I hadn't considered what came after. And now, if I wanted this to end, I'd have to be willing to finish it completely, no half measures. I realized what I had to do to end this once and for all. The opportunity came faster than I expected. 2 days later, Greg announced, loudly, as if to make a point, that he'd invited a few business associates over for dinner. My mom didn't look thrilled, but she didn't argue. I could see the calculation in Greg's eyes. He wanted to restore his image, to show her that he was still the man making deals and bringing opportunities. Mark was already in the loop. I texted him, tonight. He replied with a thumbs up. When the guests arrived, Greg slipped into his usual role, confident handshake, polished smile, carefully vague stories about market shifts and strategic alliances. It was the same script he'd used on our family 100 times, but now I knew exactly how to break it. Halfway through dinner, Mark leaned forward, feigning interest. So, Greg, that deal with Richard Holt, is it closed yet? Greg's fork froze midair. We're finalizing terms. I pushed my chair back, just enough to be heard. That's interesting, because the last email I saw from him said the deal would be dead by Friday if the wire didn't clear. And that was before he mentioned the collateral. One of the associates frowned. Collateral? Mark didn't miss his cue. He pulled a thick manila envelope from under his chair and set it on the table. Why don't you explain to them, Greg? Or should I? Greg's face went pale. This is out of context. I cut him off. The context is that you forged my mom's signature to secure a loan you couldn't pay and put her house on the line. These are the documents, signed, dated, and ready to hand over to the police if you want to keep playing games. My mom, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Her voice was calm, but every word was razor sharp. I want you out tonight. And if you're not gone by morning, these papers go to every person you owe money to and the police. The room was dead silent. One of Greg's associates muttered something about needing to step outside and quickly left. The others followed. Greg tried one last angle. If you do this, you'll ruin me. You ruined yourself, my mom said flatly. He looked at me then, and for the first time, there was no smirk, no sneer, just a flash of pure hatred. But he didn't say another word. He grabbed his coat, shoved it under his arm, and walked out the door without looking back. When the sound of his car faded down the street, my mom sat heavily in her chair. Her hands were trembling, but her eyes were steady. Thank you, she said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. Finally, the weight that had been pressing on my chest for weeks eased. Greg was gone, and this time, he wasn't coming back. I'll never forget the look on his face when he realized he'd been beaten, not by lawyers, not by rivals, but by the useless stepchild he'd spent years belittling. Greg didn't come back. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not ever. The following week, my mom had the locks changed. She called the bank, explained the forged signature, and, with Mark's help, started the legal process to have Greg removed from any claim on the property. It was messy, stressful, and expensive, but thanks to the documents we'd kept and a few well-timed phone calls, the house was safe. I watched my mom change in those weeks. She went from someone constantly trying to keep the peace, smoothing over Greg's jokes and bending under his charm, to someone who didn't hesitate to hang up on him when he tried calling from an unknown number. The extended family took a while to process everything. Some had been fooled by Greg's confidence for years and were embarrassed they hadn't seen through it. Others admitted they'd had their doubts but didn't want to get involved. But no one called me too sensitive anymore. I didn't gloat. Not out loud. The satisfaction wasn't in rubbing it in. It was in knowing Greg had left with nothing but the clothes he'd carried out that night. The man who'd built his identity on control, on making other people feel small, had been brought down by his own lies. One evening, a couple of weeks after it all ended, my mom and I sat in the kitchen drinking tea. She looked at me for a long time before saying, I should have listened to you sooner. I shrugged. You wanted to believe in him. I get it. No, she said firmly. I wanted to believe in the version of him I thought I married. But that man never existed. It was the closest she'd come to admitting how much it had hurt her. I didn't push further. Some truths were still too raw to dissect. As for me, I realized something important. Greg's useless comment had been the last time he'd underestimated me. It was also the last time anyone in that family would look at me and see someone who couldn't stand up for themselves. Life didn't magically get perfect after he left. There were still bills to handle, legal matters to settle, and a lot of quiet evenings where my mom seemed lost in thought. But the house felt different, lighter. The air wasn't thick with tension anymore. Sometimes, when I sit at that same dinner table, I remember the exact moment I decided to fight back. I remember the folder, the look on Greg's face, the way the room shifted when the truth landed. And I think about how close I came to staying silent, to letting him keep the upper hand. That's the thing about people like Greg, they count on your silence. They count on your willingness to keep the peace. But all it takes is one moment, one choice, to turn the tables. I learned that night that useless is just a word, and sometimes it's the word that pushes you to prove exactly how wrong they were.